If you have a Bible with you this morning, or if you can find a pew Bible near you, would you open up to the book of Lamentations? It's in the Old Testament just after the book of Jeremiah, who's also the author of these Lamentations. We're going to be looking at the third chapter, from which the familiar words of a couple of the hymns that we have sung this morning have come. So we'll be focusing in our sermon, chapter 3, from verse 20 to about verse 24, but I'd like to put those into the larger context by reading the first 26 verses of this chapter. Jeremiah says, in the midst of the attack by Babylon on Jerusalem and on Judah in his time, I am a man who has seen affliction under the rod of God's wrath. He has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Surely against me he turns his hand again and again the whole day long. He's made my flesh and my skin waste away. He's broken my bones. He has besieged and enveloped me with bitterness and tribulation. He's made me dwell in darkness like the dead of long ago. He's walked me about so that I cannot escape, walled me about so that I cannot escape. He's made my chains heavy. Though I call and cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. He's blocked my ways with blocks of stones. He's made my paths crooked. He is a bear lying in wait for me, a lion in hiding. He turned away my steps and tore me to pieces. He's made me desolate. He's bent his bow and set me as a target for his arrow. He drove into my kidneys the arrows of his quiver. I have become the laughing stock of all peoples, the object of their taunts all day long. He's filled me with bitterness. He has sated me with wormwood. He's made my teeth grind on gravel and made me cower in ashes. My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is. So I say, my endurance has perished, and so has my hope from the Lord. Remember my affliction and my wanderings, the wormwood and the gall. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. We've just wrapped up a year of some great challenges. There may be a few here who can look back upon 2022 as a year full of pure joy and uninterrupted growth and prosperity, but the average survivor of 2022 is more likely to be thinking of this year more like another long soundtrack from a Yoko Ono album or an episode of Les Mis. If you're the more typical worshiper here today, there are plentiful ways that you can identify with these laments of Jeremiah in this third chapter of his book about Judah's afflictions. You've been driven more than once into darkness without any light. And if it's not the flesh and skin and bones of yourself and maybe someone close to you, it may still be that feeling of walls closing in without much sign of escape, or a load of chains that seems difficult to bear. Maybe God himself has felt distant, or like a bear lying in wait for you, about to tear you to pieces. People taunt you. People don't understand you. Maybe bitterness has become your byword. You know what Jeremiah means. when he says, "My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is." Now let's acknowledge, for starters, that we in America would be a most ungrateful people if we thought life in our relatively blessed world were anything like the world of Judah in Jeremiah's time, when Jerusalem was razed to the ground and anybody with any means was taken away from their homes and families to exile in Babylon, where their freedom of worship, their freedom of speech, their hope of keeping any family traditions alive were ruthlessly taken away. Straits were so dire in Jeremiah's time, food was so scarce, people were actually resorting to cannibalism to sustain themselves. And so our lives have not nearly gotten quite so dire as Judah's, and the word of perspective is clearly in order, but still. After 3 years of COVID restrictions and their aftermath, after a couple of years of inflation have eaten away at all the advances that you were able to make, you may still harbor some bitter taste of Jeremiah's lament when he says, "My endurance has perished, and so has my hope from the Lord." Even if they're not nearly so severe as Judah's, those feelings are real. It's bad enough to come to the end of your rope with losses of dear ones in your family, trauma in the lives of your close friends and relatives, personal setbacks, disappointed hopes. But the loss of hope that the Lord still cares for you after everything that has befallen you can be the most bitter pill of all. And Jeremiah himself felt that loss of hope in the middle of Judah's trials at the hands of the arrogance, this bloodthirsty cruelty of the Babylonians, watching them tear his beloved city and temple to the ground. Where could God be in the middle of such devastation in the lives of his chosen people? And so if even a little bit of these afflictions and wanderings resonate with you at the end of another challenging year, if there's even a taste of that wormwood and gall that's caused your soul to be bowed down within you, then Jeremiah's word of encouragement in this morning's text might be a means of returning some light of hope to you, as a fresh year of possibility, fresh year of opportunity rises on the horizon on this New Year's Day, 2023. We may feel the affliction of the wrath of God and his rod. We can know and maybe have that we have felt the hand of the Lord turning against us again and again the whole day long. We can even acknowledge that the severity of his treatment is no more than we deserve for the sinfulness of our refusal to trust his just counsel about the manner in which we should walk. And still, we long for a word that this is not God's last word in our lives. That there remains for us, as there did for the exiles, some future, some hope. And New Year's beginnings turn our eyes and our sights towards that future, where we can tune our ears to hear the promises of God after all the slings and arrows of a world that is not in a position to offer us anything but temporary good fortune, and then eventual and inevitable disappointment. New Year's Day, it's like the turning point where Jeremiah stands in this chapter when he comes in verse 21 to call this to mind, and therefore I do have hope. What does he call to mind? The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will have hope in him. So if Jeremiah can offer hope to Jerusalem when it is surrounded by armies, watching its buildings being burned to the ground, watching its people being sacrificed by a ruthless Babylonian war machine, surely his hope can apply to the worst that 2022 has been able to pour out on you and your family. And so I want to help us to try to lay some practical hold on that hope this morning by listening to Scripture's answers to those three key questions that are there for you in the bulletin. Where is our hope? And the answer is clear. The Lord is my portion. Secondly, how does the Lord's portion give us that hope? And finally, maybe most urgent of all, when does that Lord's portion give me that hope? So in the wake of this long litany of woes that we read at the beginning of chapter 3 here, traumatic physical injuries, bitter emotional turmoil, deep spiritual emptiness, Jeremiah is not only clear about what hope his beleaguered contemporaries can find, he is altogether in harmony with a consistent answer that we can find so many other places in the Bible. Listen to his sequence of thought there in 21 to 23. When my soul is cast down, I call this to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. There are three constants there that provide bedrock for that anchor that he's desperately pitching out into the water from his boat to stabilize that storm-tossed ship that he's on. Number one, God's hesed. Number two, his raham. Number three, his amnah, his steadfast love, his compassion and his mercy, and his faithfulness. Why are these the constants that give us the bedrock that we need? Because his steadfast love never ceases. Because his mercy never ends. It returns like the sunrise every morning. It returns like another year does every New Year's Day. And his faithfulness, Jeremiah says, is Rav. Great, exalted, higher than everything. There's three abiding realities there that do not change, no matter how much the world's changing and unsteady circumstances might turn us around. And that's why hope can be found in those three things. In substance, they are life-giving. They are deeply encouraging. His hesed, his steadfast love. It's also the word for his covenant love. When God makes a covenant with us, he just doesn't pour down affectionate love upon us. He makes a contractual commitment of himself to us. It's like the covenant of marriage that husbands and wives make to one another. And like the intent of wedding vows, the steadfast covenant love of the Lord never ceases, despite circumstances. And so, when we need a dose of hope in our lives, Jeremiah counsels us to call this to mind. The steadfast love of the Lord, his hesed, never ceases. He's seeking you out on your storm-tossed sea to do you good. His raham, his mercies, are his profound, heartfelt sense of compassion for you in your troubles as well as in your joys. The Hebrew word that I use there is very closely related in Hebrew to the word for the womb. It's like the connection a mother has for her child. Every new morning that a mother sees her baby after a night's sleep, that compassion floods over her again, as if it were a new and rekindled bond that joined the two of them back together again. And so when we need a dose of hope in our lives, Jeremiah says, call this to mind. The daily new mercies of the Lord, his raham, never come to an end. And great is his faithfulness, his amunah. It's the word that's translated in Isaiah 33:6 as stability. God is our rock, our solid rock on which we stand. And when all around my soul gives way, he then is all my hope and stay. And so Jeremiah says again, call that to mind when you begin to lose your grip on hope. So in substance, these are deep, and they are soul-heartening truths and content. And beyond that, in endurance, these same three things, Jeremiah emphasizes, are firm. They are abiding. They are trustworthy. They never cease. They never come to an end. And the reason for that isn't very hard to understand. They're all three of them attributes of an eternal, unchanging, faithful God. And that explains why, when he gets to verse 24, he can rephrase his whole point by simply saying, the Lord is my portion, and therefore I'll have hope. The love and the faithfulness of God don't bring us hope because they answer our need with the same worldly stuff that ran out on us. What kind of hope would that be if we lost a lot of money and God just gave us some more money? Now, I suppose plenty of people might say, well, that's exactly the encouragement I was looking for. But their hope was in the money. And now their hope is back. But think again, how firm is that hope? It ran out on you once. If it could get lost, if it could get taken away, it will very likely disappear again. It's unreliable as a foundation on which to rest your needy soul. Same thing if you lost your hope because you lost your job or your home or a loved one. If God only resupplies the thing that you lost, you're just back standing on that same fragile, vulnerable source of hope again. Enjoy those things for the gift that they are, but realize you're just asking for disappointment if you set your hope in them. Don't make that mistake. Jeremiah says we can only have genuine hope when we recall this: the Lord is my portion. Now that's a phrase that's often become part of our Christian way of talking. Jonathan Edwards used it in the meditation that is at the front of the bulletin today in his miscellaneous notebook. But if we really give attention to what that phrase means, the Lord is my portion, how does it really apply to our great desire for hope in our lives? Which is the reason why Jeremiah uses this phrase. Think about that phrase and think about its promise to us. What is a portion? Portion is our share of things. It's our allotment. Maybe it's our selected quantity of food when we're dieting and worrying about portion control. Or a percentage of an inheritance. Here's your portion. This part's yours. Abraham was offered a portion of the spoils of war by the king of Sodom in Genesis 14. He wouldn't take any of it. Rachel and Leah each received a portion of the inheritance of their father's house, Genesis 31. The tribes of Israel were all allotted a portion of the promised land to possess. All except Aaron and the tribe of Levi. And instead, we read in Numbers 18:20, comes up again in Deuteronomy 18:2, the Lord says to Aaron, "You have no inheritance in the land, neither shall you have any portion among them. I am your portion and your inheritance among the people of Israel." Now there's our phrase. God is our portion. So stop and think about what that might mean. Imagine you're sitting at a table with your 12 brothers like Levi was. You're dividing up a pie or two. Everybody gets a slice of the pie. A couple pies divided up 12 ways, 6 pieces of pie makes for a pretty nice dessert. But you're Levi. No slice of pie for you. Hope for some good dessert has just been snatched away from you, and you're in some genuine dessert despair. But then comes your hope. Dad, who's been slicing up the pies, announces at the end, you, Levi, you get the house with the bakery and all the cooks. Which portion would you rather have? The slice of pie that each of your brothers got? Or the endless source of all the pies? That's the glorious news of the mercy of God that is new every morning and new with the arrival of every new year. Your portion is not the job that you just lost. It's not the friendship that just fell apart. It's not the house that just flooded. It's not any of the earthly joys that just got snatched out of your hand in these last couple of years of disappointment. Your portion is the God who graced you with your job and your friendships and your home and every other earthly blessing. And so when my soul is cast down, Jeremiah says, this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. So remember that the steadfast love that never ceases is God's covenant love. And remember that at the heart of every description that God gives of his covenant, his agreement that he makes with us when we trust him is this: I will be your God, and you will be my people. God promises to belong to us, to be our God, to put all of the power of his grace at our disposal for our eternal good. And then notice how Deuteronomy 32:9 gives us the other half of the covenant. The Lord's portion, says Deuteronomy 32, God's portion is his people. We are the inheritance that God desires. We're his people. We're the sheep of his pasture. He delights in shepherding us and providing for us. Jeremiah 9:24, Micah 7:18, they both say God delights in steadfast love. That's what he loves to do. Giving himself to us, his people, that's his portion too. But God is not covenanting with us merely to give us the things of this world where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, as Jesus reminds us in the Sermon on the Mount. Our portion is not those temporary, breakable things. Our portion is no less than God himself. And that means, as Jesus told his disciples in Mark 10, there is no one who leaves house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or lands for my sake or the gospel's who will not receive 100-fold now in this time. Houses, brothers, sisters, mothers, children's lands with persecutions, and in the age to come eternal life. So what is our hope? What is this solid rock upon which we stand when the storms of the world send us reeling with loss and disappointment? The Lord is our portion. What more do we need? God may wrestle with the sinner's restless heart, as we just sang, but his grace is enough. The prosperity and happiness of the world is not enough. God's grace is enough, and more than enough. So once we see what our hope is, the next question just about answers itself. How does the Lord's portion give us hope? The Lord's portion is so vast, it's so responsible for every earthly portion that we might desire, that when we trust God as our portion, when we leave aside the cares that we've been investing in our tiny little portions of the world, those little cares just fade into the obscurity of this drop in the ocean that might have been your year 2021 or 22 or even 23, or even the 70 that these transitory times of our earthly lives represent. The old Puritans used to look at New Year's Eve as the most important holiday of the year, much more significant for them than Christmas or Easter, because those were so commercialized. Why did they celebrate New Year's Eve so importantly? Because it was an annual reminder, year upon year, that earthly time comes to an end. It was a day on which to practice dying and to put the world into proper perspective. And then the next morning, New Year's Day, they had the gift of a fresh start, a new year of new mercies, morning by morning, laying hold of the overflowing hope that God is our portion and that his grace is enough. One of those old Puritans was an 18th century Anglican priest named John Newton. You know this man because he's the writer of one of the most well-known hymns of the church, Amazing Grace. John Newton was convinced that it is foolish to fret as much as we do over material things when we are on the way to inheriting eternal riches. He told this little story to illustrate the point. Suppose, he said, a man is going to New York to take possession of a large estate, and his carriage breaks down a mile before he gets to the city, and it obliges him to walk the rest of the way. What a fool we would think him if we saw him wringing his hands and blubbering out all the remaining mile, "Oh, my carriage is broken, my carriage is broken," when he has a great estate right in front of him. Most of us have probably suffered our broken carriages, and we've likely wrung our hands over the painful walking we've had to do because our carriage broke down. Newton's point is, if we are preoccupied with the pain and the broken pieces of our lives, it's because we've taken our eyes off of the great truth that we are on our way to a glorious inheritance. God is our portion. We're like the Levites. Our portion isn't just a piece of land, it's the creator of all the lands. That's where our hope comes from. Now, still there's a third, and there's a very anguishing question that remains. I can be very assured that God is my portion, and therefore I put my hope in him, as Jeremiah exhorts us in this passage this morning. But in my present distress and discouragement, that hope feels such a long way off. I may have a grand estate to take possession of, but this mile of walking is still a path of great pain. And from this far out, I'm barely catching any sight of that property out there that I've been promised. And on top of that, I'm feeling guilty for letting discouragement get the better of me while I walk along in my pain. But take some heart. This is not a foreign question to the writers of Scripture. 4 times in the Psalms, once again in the book of Isaiah, we hear the psalmist, we hear the prophet crying out from their heart, "How long, O Lord?" Psalm 13, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?" Psalm 35:17, "How long, O Lord, will you look on? Rescue me from destruction of these malicious witnesses who repay me evil for good. Rescue my precious life from these lions." Psalm 79:5, "How long, O Lord, will you be angry forever? Will your jealousy burn like fire?" Psalm 89:46, "How long, O Lord, will you hide yourself forever? How long will your wrath burn like fire?" And then Isaiah 6:11, Isaiah says, "How long, O Lord?" And he said, "Until cities lie waste without inhabitant, and houses without people. And the land is a desolate waste. That's a long time. And so, this is a natural question. And it is a biblical question. And perhaps for many people, even in this congregation this morning, it is an urgent question. When will this Lord's portion give me the hope that I'm waiting for? And if you search the scriptures for an answer to that soul-wrenching question, you've discovered that you can't just force a simple span of time out of any of the prophets or the apostles as a response to that question. There are layers of answers that need to be understood to discern the mind of God in the face of our impatience, that he would do things our way. Even Jesus had to plead with his Father in the Garden of Gethsemane about the road ahead of him as his carriage was about to have an abrupt head-on collision with the cross. But suppose for just a minute that God had given Jesus a plain and simple answer. Well, Jesus, 3 days. Would those 3 days of the most agonizing humiliation and excruciating execution ever devised by man have been more reassuring to him than an answer of, well, 3 years of poverty? Was Isaiah told how long his land was going to lie in desolate waste? The timing of our receiving the full measure of the glorious, God-sized inheritance that is our portion is not a simple matter of opening 24 doors on your Advent calendar to count down the days to Christmas. God works his purposes out in his own timing, his own perfect timing. There's still, though, 2 or 3 important truths about hope that I think do provide us some reassuring answers to this question, when? When does the Lord's portion give us hope? One of those truths about how an overwhelming portion gives hope is that it works by displacement. And the realization of that displacement usually comes gradually. You're Levi. That pie of the promised land has been sliced up, distributed to all your brothers and your sisters, and then you learn the happy news that instead of a piece of pie, you're getting the bakery. Are you going to get a piece of pie in the very next moment? Probably not. You're going to have to put that bakery into operation. It's going to take some time. But eventually, you're going to have all the slices of pie you ever wanted. But it's going to come gradually as you learn to put your portion to work. For a while, you're still hungry. That's how sanctification works. We are fully justified at the first moment that we trust God. That full portion of God's seeing you clothed with the righteousness of Christ is all yours from that moment on. It's like your I do at the altar of marriage. From that moment on, you are fully married. But it's still only the beginning of learning more and more what joys marriage to this partner is going to bring as the years pass by. And over time, as Romans 8:29 tells us, we're going to become conformed more and more into the image of Christ, our bridegroom. Even though, fully and legally, he became fully our bridegroom that moment that we first trusted him. A long time ago, back when I was a young kid, I apparently was pretty reckless and clumsy. I had about 5 sets of stitches by the time I was 8 years old. And at first they were all pretty ugly, scary scars. 3 on my face. The 4th one was a tear from some barbed wire stretched over half of my thigh. That was one awful, visible scar that remained pretty prominent for years and years of my younger life. But as the portion of my growing body got taller and bigger and older, all of my new growth kept on making that huge scar look smaller and smaller. Today, what once covered half my leg, hardly visible at all. Sometimes God's steadfast hope gives us hope. His love gives us hope that way. The full portion of God that we have today comes to have greater and greater effect as time goes on to prove its reality and its faithfulness to us. And so one answer to the question, when does the Lord's portion give us hope, is that hope builds over time. As new mercies bring us fresh and added displacement by the Lord's portion every new morning and every new year. Here's another truth about the overwhelming portion that God gives us that allows us to say, along with Jeremiah, therefore I will have hope in him. The second truth is the certainty of the promise that we have that the Lord is our portion. It may build gradually, but as God assured Habakkuk when he stood up on his watchtower and he witnessed the Babylonians bearing down on his world with destruction, severe disappointment of Judah's earthly hopes, God says to him, still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. The Lord's portion that restores our hope is certain. Paul says it again in Romans chapter 8, verse 24. Hope that is not seen, or hope that is seen, it's not really hope. Who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Why? It's certain. Hosea puts it like this in chapter 6. Let's press on to know the Lord. His going out is as sure as the dawn. New mercies every morning. He will come to us as the showers and as the spring rains that water the earth. New mercies are sure as the arrival of the morning sunrise or the appearance of a new year. Ask yourself this, as much stress as you may have encountered during this last year, did you ever entertain so much as a doubt that 2023 would arrive today? That's how certain the arrival of God's new mercies every morning and an eventual enjoyment of that full inheritance of our portion in the Lord is going to be for our lives. And then, because a full measure of the joy of the Lord will one day be ours with certainty, a third truth emerges to underscore this declaration of Jeremiah in chapter 3, verse 21. This I call to mind, God's covenant love, his mercies, his faithfulness, and therefore I have hope. Present tense. I have hope, even today. Even while the full measure of its effects may seem slow and call upon patience, the certainty of its complete victory transforms the darkness of our circumstances even today, in the middle of those circumstances. Imagine you're lying in a hospital bed, terrible pain. Part of the distress of your agony and your anxiety is that you don't know where this illness is about to take you. Are you going to go from bad to worse? Are you ever going to make it back home again? Will this pain ever subside? And then the doctor walks in with your lab reports and he delivers the good news that the illness that you have is temporary and it is curable. You should be home in another week or so, on the mend, headed to recovery. Does this news make your pain suddenly go away? No. But it does transform the outlook that you have on life because it has restored your hope for the future. We'd all much rather be that person in that bed who's heard the encouraging news of a promising outcome than the person in the next hospital bed who's in identical pain but is still anxious about whether there's any hope for recovery. And so calling to mind this certainty that God is covenantally dedicated to giving us himself as our portion, that his mercies will be trustworthy every new morning, every new year, that his faithfulness is as great as the heavens, we have hope right now. So as the musicians come to prepare us for the Lord's table, I want to say that whatever 2020 or 21 or 22 may have dealt you in your worldly troubles, whatever 2023 may add to your earthly trials, God remains our portion. His faithfulness is great, and therefore we have hope. Our hope is in the Lord, and the strongest evidence that we have of his great faithfulness and his new mercies stands before us on this table where we're about to gather and dine with Christ. Romans 8:32 reminds us of the assurance that this table represents for us. So keep this reminder before your eyes as we share these memorials of God's sacrificial death for us in Christ. God, who did not spare his own Son, but gave himself up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? This table reminds us God has already done the hardest thing in sacrificing his own Son in our place. And so answering our cry for hope and mercy in the middle of this world's storms, that's easy. That's delightful. And God is pleased to do that. How could there be any doubt left that he would keep his joyful promise to be our full portion for those who trust him? And so call on his great faithfulness. Call on his new mercies every morning. Call those things to mind, and we will have hope.